I'm going to read to you Dear Mr. Dickens by Nancy Chernin, illustrated by Bethany Stancliffe. Think of someone famous you admire. What would you do if that person said or wrote something unfair? Would you speak up? Would you risk getting that person angry? Eliza Davis did. Charles Dickens was the most famous writer of Eliza's time. English people from all walks of life eagerly paid 2p for his weekly magazine all the year round to read the latest instalments of his stories. Later he published the stories as books that passengers bought at bookshops and railway stations. But what made Charles Dickens a hero in Eliza's eyes is that he used the power of his pen to help others. When he wrote about children forced to labour in workhouses, people demanded change. When his readers were moved to tears by tales of families struggling in desperate, dirty conditions, they gave what they could to charities, as did Eliza. Yes, Dickens had a heart as big as England, overflowing with compassion for everyone, except... Eliza remembered when she read Dickens' book Oliver Twist about a poor orphan. She had loved it at first, until she got to chapter 8, where she read about the old shrivelled Jew teaching Oliver to steal. Eliza was Jewish. Charles Dickens described the Jew as dishonest, selfish, cruel, and ugly. The character's name was Fagin, but over and over Dickens wrote the Jew, the Jew, the Jew. Each time the word hurt like a hammer on Eliza's heart. England was already a difficult place for Jewish people in the 1860s. Many jobs were closed to them. They didn't have the right to vote, or to study, or work at universities. If people thought that all Jews were like Fagin, would Jewish people ever be treated fairly? Someone had to speak up. But who? Eliza wasn't famous or powerful, but she had the same 3 things that Charles Dickens had: a pen, paper, and something to say. She sat down and wrote a letter. Dear Mr. Dickens. Eliza dipped her pen in ink. Watching the dark liquid rippling, she hesitated. Who was she to tell the great man what to say? What if her letter made him write things that were even worse? But maybe he would change. Didn't lots of people in Dickens's own novels change, like Ebenezer Scrooge? Eliza's pen scratched her paper. She wrote that Dickens's portrayal of Fagin encouraged a vile prejudice. She asked him to atone for a great wrong. She blotted the ink. She walked to the postbox, her little son skipping behind. Would Charles Dickens read her letter? Would he write back? At his stately house in Kent, Dickens studied the letter that a Mrs. Eliza Davis had sent from London. A vile prejudice, the letter said. He frowned as he picked up his pen and began his response. A little more than 2 weeks later, Eliza was holding the envelope with the reply from Charles Dickens. She opened it eagerly. Her hands trembled as she read. Fagin, Dickens had written sharply, was based on real criminals who were Jewish. There are bad people in the book who are not Jewish too. Atone for a great wrong? Any Jewish people who thought him unfair or unkind, and that included Eliza, were not sensible or just or good-tempered, he said. He might as well have said, bah, humbug. Eliza stared at the page. The most famous author of her day, a man known to use his powerful pen for good, didn't like what she had to say. She tried and failed. She could cry or... She sat at her desk. She tapped her foot. Dickens's words moved countless readers to compassion. If only she could find the words to move one particular reader. Scrooge didn't change until after he was visited by the ghosts of the past, present, and future. Eliza's letter summoned those spirits too. Dear Mr. Dickens. Eliza wrote of Dickens's past, of how he loved Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe as a boy. Did he remember Scott's great Jewish characters, the noble Isaac of York and his beautiful daughter Rebecca, a skilled healer? She wrote of Dickens' present. She said that while some of his non-Jewish characters were criminals, all his Jewish characters were criminals. That does not present Jewish people as they really are. She wrote of Dickens' future. Generations would judge him by how he judged others, including her people, she told him. She blotted the ink. She put everything she had to say in one letter. Would it be too much? Would it be enough? She slipped it in an envelope. At the postbox, she let her young son mail it. Months passed with no word from Charles Dickens. Eliza worried. She heard he was working on a new book. Was he as angry as he'd been after her first letter? Would he write characters worse than Fagin? Finally, chapters of Dickens's novel, Our Mutual Friend, began to appear in monthly instalments. Eliza rushed to the newsstand and paid her shillings to read them. She thumbed through the pages, shaking when she realized he had indeed created another Jewish character. Had her fears come true? But no. Mr. Rear was generous and loyal. Dickens named him after the Hebrew word re'ah, meaning friend. Eliza read the part where Lizzie Hexam, a young woman Mr. Rear helps, says of the Jews, "I think there cannot be kinder people in the world." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Dear Mr. Dickens, I thank you very earnestly, Eliza wrote, for a great compliment paid to myself and to my people. Dickens wrote back quickly. I have received your letter with great pleasure, he said, and hope to be, as I have always been in my heart, the best of friends with the Jewish people. And he was. Charles Dickens became, as he'd written of Scrooge, better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. He published essays in his magazine protesting prejudice, including one that addressed how the Jewish people have too long been wronged by Christian communities. During Oliver Twist's reprinting, he told the printer to take out many instances of the Jew and change them to Fagin, to make it clear that Fagin didn't represent all Jewish people. A grateful Eliza wrote Dickens one more note, not on paper, but in a copy of an English Hebrew Bible that she gave him as a gift. She praised him for having the noblest quality man can possess, the ability to atone or make amends for a wrong. Dickens wrote back one last time. He was glad she'd spoken up to make things right, he told her. Eliza was glad she'd spoken up too.